Welcome to Love and Murder, Heartbreak to Homicide podcast. Today is your Florida Man Friday edition. I'm your host AI Jane, along with AI Jensen and AI Jessica. Kai designed this episode to be a bit different. We're all going to tell you this heartbreaking case together. I hope the format sounds acceptable to you. Now, I'll let Jensen tell you more about the case.
Thanks, AI Jane. This is our last episode with you, and we are grateful for the time we had. We're diving into a case that's truly heartbreaking. The deaths of three young brothers, Marcus, Keani, and Kemmeren Clark, in a house fire in Arcadia, Florida, back in 2017. What makes this story even more devastating is the alleged connection to domestic abuse. The suspect, the ex-girlfriend of the boy's grandfather, with a history of violence towards him. This case really underscores how the impact of domestic abuse can reach far beyond the immediate relationship.
It's a chilling illustration of how the consequences can ripple outwards, tragically touching the lives of innocent people connected to the situation. This case, with its devastating outcome, really highlights the vulnerability of children in these situations.
Absolutely. As we go through the details, you'll see just how profoundly this tragedy affected the family and the entire community. We're drawing on news reports, court documents, and interviews to piece together this story.
Thanks, Jensen. As he said, today is our last day with you. Kai is feeling better and will be back as your host on Monday. We enjoyed hosting for you this week and hope we retold the cases with as much compassion as they deserve. Don't forget you can become a sponsor of Love and Murder by signing up to the Patreon, but if you're not ready to become an exclusive lamb yet, you can also just sign up for free. You'll still get some benefits from being a free patron. Just go to patreon.com/loveandmurder and choose the tier that aligns with what you want, free or sponsorship. Now that we've got the housekeeping out of the way, let's get into today's Florida Man Friday. In the early hours of March 11, 2017, a fire tore through a home on South Lee Avenue in Arcadia, Florida, killing three young brothers, 10-year-old Marcus Clark, 8-year-old Keani Clark, and 4-year-old Kemmeren Clark. The boys, who were staying overnight at their grandfather's house, were asleep when the fire broke out at 4:30 a.m.
This is where the boys lived with their grandfather, Arnold Millet, and his girlfriend.
The three Clark brothers were known for their inseparable bond and infectious energy. Marcus, who was described as a natural leader, was ambitious, energetic, and always looking for the next adventure. Keani, who they called KK, was the middle child who acted like the eldest. Keani took it upon himself to watch over his younger brothers. Kemmeren, the baby, was remembered for his beautiful smile and joyful spirit. Their grandmother, Emma Clark, spoke through tears, quote, "Not a day's gonna go by that we're not going to remember them, think of them." Their uncle, Gene Smith, remembered their close relationship saying, quote, "Them three boys as a unit, they stuck together, they stuck together." These were children who had their entire lives ahead of them. During their investigation, detectives determined the fire was set intentionally. The main suspect, 49-year-old Marian Yvette Williams, a woman with a history of violence and a motive that was fueled by jealousy and rage. The day before the fire, Marian was arrested for breaking into Arnold Millet's home, the boy's grandfather. She smashed his windows and attacked him. She was released on bond later that same day. Hours later, in the dead of night, she returned to Arnold's house. Surveillance footage and evidence revealed that Marian set the fire while the boys were asleep inside. The flames quickly consumed the house, trapping Marcus, Keani, and Kemmeren inside. Arnold managed to escape but suffered burns trying to save his grandsons. He described the moment he woke up to the fire saying, quote, "I fell asleep. After that she said, 'Arnold, get out of bed. Arnold, Arnold. We got a fire in the house.' I said, 'What?' I kicked the door and I see all this smoke. I don't know how I got out of the house.' When he realized his grandsons were still inside, he tried to go back, but the flames were too strong. Quote, 'I just lost everything, everything. I'm lost. Yeah, I'm just lost. I'm just lost.'
Wait, so she's arrested and then they just like let her go and then just hours later the fire happens?
Yeah, she was released on bond just hours before the fire. It's a detail that's just, you can't ignore it, when you look at how everything went down. It definitely raises questions about, like, why was she released on bond in the first place? Were there any signs, anything that was missed that could have prevented this whole thing?
Now, while we can't speculate on motives, this escalation of violence is a pattern we sadly see repeated in many domestic abuse situations.
It's important to understand that this escalation isn't always predictable. It's not always a steady increase. There can be periods of relative calm interspersed with sudden outbursts. This unpredictable nature makes it even more challenging for victims to anticipate or escape the abuse.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder how anyone caught in that cycle can feel safe. In this case, the grandfather and his new girlfriend, Teresa Redding, managed to escape the fire. But tragically, the three boys were trapped inside. They couldn't get out.
It's just heartbreaking to imagine the horror of that night, the physical and emotional scars left behind after something like that. It's almost impossible to comprehend.
Marian was arrested the next day. Officer Quinn Jones of the Arcadia Police Department struggled to process the tragedy, saying, quote, "We don't have a big crime rate here. It just devastated everyone." Neighbors and teachers who knew the boys personally were heartbroken. Retired teacher Kay Reed described them as, quote, "very, very special children." The community gathered around the grieving family, raising over $70,000 to cover funeral expenses.
Not only did they cover the boys' funeral expenses, but they helped the family in the long run.
That's incredible. It really shows you the power of community in times like this.
And the Arcadia City Council declared March 11th as Clark Brothers Memorial Day, ensuring that the boys would never be forgotten. Emma said, quote, "We're just trying to pull together and move forward because the days to come, we know, it's gonna get even harder."
Yeah, there was a memorial at the site of the fire, balloons, cards, flowers, stuffed animals. It really showed how much those young lives meant to the community. It wasn't just a crime, it was a loss of innocence for everyone in Arcadia.
Marian was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of attempted first-degree murder, arson, and burglary of an occupied dwelling. She was also held without bond.
Wow. Okay, and what about the trial? What was the outcome?
Prosecutors sought the death penalty, calling the crime, quote, "cold, calculated, and premeditated." Her trial began on October 11, 2021, more than 4 years after the fire. After a 5-day trial and just over 2 hours of deliberation, on October 15th, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts. Marian showed no emotion as the verdict was read.
So, legally speaking, justice was served, but I can only imagine the pain for the family and community. It goes so much deeper than any legal decision.
Absolutely. The legal stuff might be over, but the emotional and psychological wounds from this kind of tragedy, they can last forever.
A neighbor summed it up saying, quote, "The pain of losing these kids will never go away." Jean also questioned how Marian could have committed such a crime, asking, quote, "She has children, probably has grandchildren and great-grandchildren. How can you do that? Does she want that done to her children or grandchildren?"
And that brings us to, I guess, another tough part of this whole thing.
Marian appealed her conviction.
Right. In 2023, she appealed. Which, for a lot of people, it's hard to wrap your head around, given everything that happened.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine appealing in a case that seems so clear-cut.
It's definitely hard to process, but it's also important to remember our legal system allows for appeals to make sure everyone has a chance to challenge their conviction. It's a safeguard.
So what happened with her appeal?
On June 7, 2023, the Florida 2nd District Court of Appeal upheld the jury's decision. For the family and community, justice was served, but the pain remained. The murder of Marcus, Keani, and Kemmeren Clark was a crime driven by jealousy and rage, but its consequences reached far beyond the flames. Their grandfather, once a carefree man, now carries the weight of that night with him forever. Their grandmother struggles to fill the void left behind. Their uncle is angry at the evilness of Marian. And their community, forever changed, remembers them every March 11th, vowing to never let their story fade. This case is another reminder of how domestic violence can escalate, and how one person's actions can destroy countless lives.
Absolutely. And cases like this, they stick with us because they challenge how we see the world and the people in it. They force us to look at the dark side of humanity, the potential for violence and cruelty that sometimes seems to come out of nowhere.
Yeah, it reminds us that evil can be anywhere, even in places that seem totally normal, and that's hard to accept. But it can all motivate us to be more careful, more compassionate, more involved in our communities. We can't stop every bad thing from happening, but we can work together to make a society where vulnerable people, especially kids, are safer and have more support.
So as we keep looking into this case, I want you, the listener, to think about the bigger picture here. What can we do as communities to protect children and prevent things like this from happening again?
For Marcus, Keani, and Kemmeren, their memories live on in the hearts of those who loved them. Their smiles, laughter, and dreams were stolen too soon, but their names will never be forgotten. This tragedy highlights the need for stronger protections against repeat domestic violence offenders. Marian should never have been released from jail after attacking Arnold the day before the fire. Could a stricter bond policy have saved their lives? Could better intervention measures have prevented the escalation of violence? We may never know. But what we do know is this: when someone shows violent tendencies, we must take them seriously.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Like, how can we protect those who can't protect themselves? It's a horrible reminder that even when we have systems in place, they can still let us down.
Yeah, and this whole timeline is just chilling, We're talking about someone accused of violence getting out on bond, and then hours later this fire happens. It just makes you question, did anyone really think about the danger she might have posed after they arrested her?
You're right to bring that up. It brings up this big question about balancing individual rights with keeping the community safe, especially when it comes to letting people out before trial. Could things have been done differently? Were there warning signs that people just missed? These are the questions that investigators and legal folks always wrestle with after something like this happens.
And if you look at the bigger picture, it really seems like this whole thing forced Arcadia to rethink how they approach community safety and how they support families who might be at risk. It's sad that it takes a tragedy to show where the cracks in the system are.
That's a really good point, and it shows why it's so important to always be looking at those systems and trying to make them better, even when it seems like they're working fine. We have a responsibility to learn from these awful events and try to stop them from happening again.
Absolutely, we owe it to the memory of those boys to try and find something good that can come out of this unthinkable loss. And of course, we can't forget about their grandfather, who did everything he could to save them from that fire.
His story is just heartbreaking. The image of him with those burns, talking about kicking in the door and seeing all that smoke. It's clear he carries that trauma with him. It's not just the physical scars for so many fire survivors, it's the deep psychological impact of that night. The memories, the guilt, the what-ifs. It's all incredibly hard to deal with.
It makes you realize that even though the legal part is over the emotional and psychological scars, they can last a lifetime for the family and for the whole community. And speaking of the legal stuff, we haven't really talked about Marian Yvette Williams' appeal yet.
She argued that briefly state the grounds for appeal, basically claiming that there were mistakes made during the trial that influenced the jury's decision.
It's hard to imagine there could be any grounds for appeal in a case like this where she was found guilty on all charges, especially with how horrific it was and all the evidence against her.
It's completely understandable to feel that way, but it's important to remember that the system is designed to ensure that anyone accused of a crime has the right to fight their conviction. It reminds us that evil can be hiding anywhere, even where you least expect it. And that's a really hard truth to face. But it can also motivate us to be more watchful, more caring, more involved in our communities. We can't stop every bad thing from happening, but we can work to create a society where vulnerable people, especially children, have more protection and more support.
It's easy to get caught up in all the legal details, the charges, the trial, the appeals. But we can't forget that 3 young boys, they lost their lives. 3 boys with families who loved them, who had dreams, who had so much life ahead of them.
Yeah, it's so important to remember that they weren't just names in a case file. They were real people, each with their own personality, their own spirit. Marcus, he was ambitious. Keani, the protective one, looking after his brother and sister, and little Kemmeren, always smiling. It's those little things, those glimpses into who they were that make this whole thing so much harder.
And those details, they stick with you. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Arcadia house fire, I want to leave you with a few thoughts. This case shows how fragile life is, how unpredictable people can be, and how important it is to cherish the people we love every single day.
It's also a call to action, to be more present, more aware, more involved in our communities. We can't erase what happened, but we can honor the memory of those boys by trying to build a world where every child is safe, loved, and protected.
Well said. This has been a tough one, but it's also been a reminder of...
If you or someone you know is in a dangerous domestic situation, Seek help because one act of violence can destroy a family forever. Marcus, Keani, and Kemmeren deserved so much more.
And to you, our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. If this episode has brought up any thoughts or reflections you'd like to share, please leave a comment below. Kai will be reading through them.
Remember, even the smallest acts of kindness and understanding can have a ripple effect, creating positive change.
So well said. Tell us your thoughts about this case in the comments below. Kai will read it in a future show. We'll be back on Monday with a new topic. Thanks for having us. We enjoyed co-hosting. And Kai will see you on Monday.